Nadimullah here with another edition of SIA Analysis. SIA Analysis में मेरी कोशिश ये होती है कि जो रिसर्च से चीज़ें निकलती हैं इकोनॉमिक्स के बारे में उस पे बात की जाए ताकि हमारी अंडरस्टैंडिंग इकोनॉमिक्स की बढ़े थोड़ी सी। और इकोनॉमिक्स में सिर्फ ये नहीं समझता कि हमारी पॉलिसी क्या है, इकोनॉमिक्स पढ़ाई भी क्या है, रिसर्च भी क्या है, टीचिंग भी क्या है, तो उसके बारे में बात करते हैं अभी। तो टुडे आई एम गोइंग टू लुक एट द situation on economic research in Pakistan. Okay, what is the state of economic research in Pakistan? How do we, what sort of research is being conducted, and how do we look at that research? So today I'm going to talk about that. Now, the what I've done is I've taken a look at a lot of research in Pakistan. I've reviewed about 500 papers and used all kinds of measures, including using artificial intelligence, Google Scholar, RAPEC, SSRN, Scopus, and many things, and tried to figure out, using all the tools that I have and all the papers that I could read, what is the state of research on Pakistan and what can we learn from Pakistani research on economic policy in Pakistan. I noticed that in a lot of countries, economic policy and research has had an effect on economic policy. The classic case of this is all the way back to John Stuart Mill and Ricardo, who shaped the free trade policy of England. Later on, Marx shaped the birth of the Soviet Union and the whole Marxist dialogue. And eventually, so on and so forth, until Lord Keynes came and gave us a new way of looking at macroeconomics, and it was implemented very quickly. And later, Hayek and Friedman debated the Keynesians to develop a whole new framework for developing a Thatcherite and Reagan revolution. So with that background in mind, I'm trying to look at what our researchers are developing so that our policy can learn from that. But as you know, I have also, what do you call it, done this before with you, where I have looked at how the donors learn about Pakistan and how they work on Pakistan, because they eventually make the policy. But our researchers can only have some influence in this field if they actually propose some ideas or debate the donors, because otherwise the donors and the bureaucrats make the policies. But then I want to look at how our researchers debate policies and how our researchers put forward competing ideas so that they can be a part of the game. They can be at the table of policy. And so let's look at that. Let's see what we can learn from there. So I'm going to look at two things. Why economic research in Pakistan fails and what countries that actually developed did differently. So let's look at that. I think it's very important, as I said, I've laid the basis for why I'm doing it, because the economic research must matter. We must, I mean, there's 260 universities now teaching economics. There are tons of economic theses coming out. There's tons of PhDs in economics roaming around, and some of them are unemployed. Do their theses, does this research add to anything? I myself created the famous Rasta program, where I thought I could get fund research by professors, and that'll bring meaningful change. But unfortunately, professors have not done much, and that program has been hijacked. So we really don't know what we can learn from that. It wasn't developed well enough. It hadn't gone too far. Do our researchers understand our own constraints to growth, our own constraints to development? And can they compete with donors for driving domestic policy? Do they have enough? Have they developed enough knowledge? Have they developed enough ideas for reform? Or is it just CV building that's happening? So let's look at what they've been looking at, what they've been doing. Here is some of the stuff that I've come up with. I put them in charts. Most of our work in economics clusters in lower rigor, low relevance categories. My conclusion, you may disagree with it, but let's talk about it. 40% of the research is regression based. Some 20% is survey based. But when I say surveys, really, it's not real surveys. It's just small mini surveys that people do, questionable and not very clear what they're doing. Um, and most of the research then eventually ends up being opinion pieces where they sort of come up and say climate change is bad and we must do more climate change. And when they come up and they say, oh, there are too many poor people and we must have more anti-poverty studies. There's some case studies, but really, again, not very well done. On the structural issues, on the real issues of Pakistan, only about 3 or 4% of people, let's say, what do I mean by real issues? I'll come to that later. Getting into more detail, we have fiscal policy and tax. Okay, not bad, about 6% of the papers. Openness in trade, about 10% of the papers. And I'll get into details on this. Deregulation is only about 2%. Can you imagine? Governance is 30%, not, about 11%, not bad. Cities and urban is very little, about 1%. And human resource and government, hardly any, maybe about 0.2%. Climate change, look at that. Wow. We are rich in climate change, about 20%. Women and gender, again, very rich, about 18%. Growth, well, about 4%. Investment, only about 2%. Well, how do you have growth without investment? Okay, poverty, about 8%. Others, well, so there you have a little bit of analysis. And the same thing can be looked at in a pie chart, but let's move on from there. Now, what I call structural research, which is looking at the structural reform of Pakistan. What is that structural reform? I know this term is used very loosely. What is structural reform? Structural reform is where, to my mind, where the structure of the economy changes. Where, for example, the governance system changes. The colonial governance system, the judiciary, and the civil service that we've clutched to our heart is reformed. Where the system and incentives in the government, which are based on protection, perks, protocol, and plots, that changes. Where we modernize our systems, those ideas or items are not researched at all. So what I see is people have learned econometrics in this country, which is very good, which is excellent. But they've learned only the method. They've only learned how to work the packages. Standard pattern is take a small data set, either pick up some time series data from the State Bank or the World Bank, throw in 10 to 15 variables in a regression package, and without any reason, just have a regression. Like, growth causes climate change, or climate change causes growth, or growth causes poverty. Report significant R squared and move on. And then make generic recommendations like grow the economy for poverty reduction. Exports-led growth is important. Grow exports for grow export-led growth. There is no causal identification. There's no institutional context. There is no serious political economy. Most of the samples are very tiny. People typically go and collect a 100, 200 paper sample perception survey, go to some students or go to some, wherever and collect a small survey, use some management, education, psychology type stuff. How do you feel about growth? How do you feel about education? How do you feel that? And nothing really that addresses what the key issues are. They have 100, 300 sample and then they run regressions. Then there are these opinion pieces like globalization and development, the role of our ICT in economic growth, women empowerment and SDGs. Oh, SDGs is a big thing. You do anything and you can link it to SDGs. You can link gender to environment, gender to the mountains, gender to this, to rivers, everything. Heavy referencing of global work, very few local citations, and you can check by the citations, many of them are citation clubs. Most of the work is kind of copying the international community. Very little work on Pakistani institutions and incentives. And you can see where the donors choose the research. There's strong alignment with the World Bank, UN, IMF. When they want climate change, we ramp up climate change. When they want gender, we ramp up gender. When they want poverty, we ramp up poverty, but we don't think about our own problems. And of course, funding is available for climate change, poverty, and all these things. You can even if you write a lot about climate change, even though it's shoddy pieces, you get to be taken to COP in, the famous COP conference in Brazil and wherever. And there are lots of little micro things that, yeah, there's a whole fad of RCTs. Well, Pakistanis can't do RCTs because really we don't have the funding for RCTs. But you admire the RCTs, and the RCT people have taken over economics too. But they give you little, did you have coffee this morning or did you not have coffee this morning? And if you had coffee, you'll do better. So, I mean, it doesn't really mean anything. But most of our research is implementing global fashions, not producing local ideas. What is missing is, for example, most of the work is on key things, as I said, donor funded topics, health, education, gender, climate. But we don't understand anything about health and education apart from saying repeatedly that there are 40 million or 100 million kids out of school. We learn very little about education. We learn so much about education that people are deprived of education, but we have no idea why we provide such poor quality education. We have no idea where growth is declining and low. We have no idea why poverty is declining and low. Everybody talks about elite capture, but we have very little idea what elite capture is and how it happens. So let's look further at detailed 50 papers, randomly selected papers that I examined in detail. Here you have poverty. Sorry, growth is the highest. Imagine 23% growth, 22% poverty. Inflation is so high. Remittances are very high. Climate change is very high. Islamic economics is very high. Gender is very high. IMF program is, there. Then you've got everything. But look at this. Evaluation of policy is very low. Evaluation of markets is very low. And if you go further, evaluation of donors is very low. Judicial reform, nothing. Regulation, very low. Sugar, which is a major crisis, very low. And I looked at energy too. Energy is very low. So the papers on growth, let's look at them a little more closely. The papers on growth are really not on growth. They do not study productivity, markets, technologies, cities, innovation, etc. The engines of growth they don't study. Simple GDP regressions dressed up as growth analysis. For example, take 10 countries, run a growth regression. And growth regressions were in vogue in the 90s, but they died out in the early 2000s. But we are still running those regressions. Yes, there's some ARDL, VAR, and people have got used to doing that. So we have mechanical correlation exercise. X increases growth, Y reduces growth, and that's it. Lots of growth papers, but no real analysis of what we can do for increasing growth in Pakistan. They're descriptive, not diagnostic. Look at this poverty inequality, 20%, climate change, you see the same thing happening again. But if you go down, industrial productivity is very low, urban economics is very low. Protectionism, arbitrary tax policy, we have very little on tax policy. Proper tax policy, not just taking taxes and regressing them on something. Very little. Property rights, hardly anything. Transactions cost nothing. Nothing on land allotments, which is such a big thing in Pakistan. Nothing on VIP housing. Nothing on agency evaluation of the government agencies that operate. For example, recently I put out evaluations of TDAP, evaluations of vacuum property board. There's so many things to be evaluated. Policies, we don't do that. Well, let's look at the poverty literature closely. We have some HIS-based regressions, but HIS is now old. 2018-19 comes out again. We'll have the same regressions run again. What does it tell us? So we have poverty increasing or poverty reducing. But do they even give us I've written about it recently, do they even give us a standard error? No. So if the poverty increases by or reduces by 1%, is it really a significant change? We don't know. Inequality worsens. I don't know. Is it improving, decreasing? I don't know what happens. What should be the poverty level we should aim for? Is it zero? Can we have zero poverty level? Is it possible to have? So I think nobody really talks about that. But then again, we don't get deeper. What keeps people poor? Is there opportunity in the country? Do land markets work for the poor? Does tenancy work for the poor? Do cities work for the poor? After all, cities are what liberated people from poverty all over the world. It is the city that allows people to come out of poverty, even if he lives in a slum, even if she comes to the city and roughs it out for two, three generations, or one generation, or two generations. I don't care. Informality is a slum. So what's wrong with that? Let it happen. Urban sprawls are not good for poverty. We know that. Regressive taxation is bad for poverty. Weak courts, cartelized sectors, these are not studied at all. So, percentage of papers on evaluation of in Pakistani economics. Rural development programs, yeah, they're about 5%, but none of them really evaluate the program. Employment programs, 4%. Public works, these really do not evaluate the work. They're very descriptive. They do not come out with hard evaluations telling us what's wrong or how the agencies, for example, have indulged in mission creep or how they've lost focus from the original purpose. What was the objective of the agency, and how has that objective either been achieved or not achieved? Um, let's look at IMF evaluation. We have only about 1.5% papers on IMF evaluation. They really do not do a good job of evaluation. They're really looking at the IMF outcomes and just describing them more than anything else. They really do not get deep into the issues as to what was the reason that they failed. World Bank ADB, as you can see, they're very, very small numbers out there. PSTP, which is a big thing in Pakistan, PSTP has failed in many ways and very few papers on PSTP. Circular debt, which is strangling our economy, circular debt has been there for 40 years and it's really strangling our economy. Every year it creeps up by 1 or 2 trillion rupees. Unfortunately, very little on that. Debt sustainability, yes, there are a few papers, but again, what are they? What is the analysis? The analysis eventually comes out to be lower the interest rate, go into financial repression or something. They don't worry about how, for example, the yield curve is managed. They don't worry about the composition, international versus local composition of debt. They don't worry about the fact that debt can be inflated away and how does it show us or forecast the possibility of debt sustainability. There's very little work on evaluation of markets and policies. So this is a very, very interesting. Let's look at education. Much research subject in education. What do we have? We have method use, some surveys, simple regressions again, casual methods, institutional analysis. But what do we find? People look at teacher stress again, perception. Are you stressed? People look at some, performance evaluations, correlation system with. Um, they look at some public versus private comparison, some gender barriers. As I said, we find out very little about what is the structure of education system. For example, I remember one paper Asim Khaja, etc., did a long time ago, which showed that public sector teachers get paid more than private sector teachers, but yet the public sector salaries are low. Okay, why is the public sector performing so badly? Why? Is it because they don't get the money? They have the money. Is it because of the governance system? My hypothesis is it's because they're run bureaucratically. They're run by a Ministry of Education. Why should there be a Ministry of Education? Why are teachers transferred? Why are teachers used politically? Why are they employed politically? Now, these issues are seldom addressed. Secondly, for example, what should be the education system? Should it be that I did a survey of the textbook boards. Should we even have textbook boards now? Textbook boards are captured mafias, and they are actually producing low quality books which go into the government schools, not the private schools. That may be one reason why our education system in the government is so producing such low quality education. Missing in studying. For example, they keep saying institutional structure, market structure, pedagogy, the urban access, all missing. There are more perception-based surveys and, general World Bank type things like how many children are out of school, how many children can attend school, how many children do this, can they pass fourth grade exam, that kind of things. Quality scores, if crude quality scores, methodologies to insight is low, originality and policy relevance is very low. So, what should good research focus on? For example, we should look at classrooms. How they're behaving, how are teachers, children are engaged. Should they even challenge our perception? Should they even have 5 day schools? Should they have 1 2 day schools? Should they? What kind of technology is used in schools, etc.? Incentives, teachers. What incentives do they have? The principal, for example, is running the school like a mafia. The education secretary is running all schools like his own little personal handmaiden. And then, what is the opportunity? What are the returns to education? How many kids actually have a chance of social mobility if by gaining education? If social mobility is low, and people know that they're not going to get anywhere. I remember I did this survey a long time ago in Dubai, written about it, that people say, I don't want an education because I'm not going to climb the social ladder. I'm going to remain where I am. So what's the point? Then urban access, urban areas, for example, children, can they get to school or not easily? What can happen? So all these things, and then evaluations of the school system, of schools individually. These are all, I mean, for example, one of the reasons that I did Rasta was that I wanted everybody to be able to, all local researchers to be able to get into their local schools and local areas and study local problems. Now, researchers sitting in universities, if they're running regression on global issues and not trying to find out what's happening locally with or without regressions, they're not going to give us anything of value. Climate change is another issue that hugely studied. Let's look at that. Pakistan climate change research looks big, but think small. Most papers are regressions of CO2 on GDP, surveys showing that heat, flood, droughts are bad for farmers and the poor. We know they're bad. What is the point of telling us bad? They're bad. And how do we know that the quantities that are coming up are correct or not? And how do we even measure them? But we don't know what every person knows, that the floods are exacerbated by land use and zoning. When the zoning issue where people can't build in cities and they're looking for land outside the city, they have to go into floodplains. There is incentives for building in the floodplains and no punishment for building in the floodplains. The whole system of, which I've talked about very often, the whole system of making societies and making these Plotistan is so flawed and so bureaucratic that people get away with it. Nobody studies Plotistan. Nobody studies the societies and the housing thing. People blame real estate, but nobody studies this urban sprawl. I mean, I can take some credit for it. I'm the only person who's been arguing for it, but very little has been done on it. Government irrigation and drainage systems, nobody looks at them. And you know how energy contracts, circular debt lock us into a dirty, expensive system. And now I would also say another thing. This is, I would say another thing that mm, um, another very important thing is how this um, huge desire by our politicians to use the PSTP to create more signal-free corridors and more um, flyovers, which has expanded our cities beyond border, beyond limits, also means that by definition we'll go into the floodplain. Now, this is something that we should talk about. And again, it ties into the PSTP, it ties into other things. Yet these links are not made. We treat research as silos. We are talking about climate change, so let's not talk about the behavior. Oh, yes, another very important thing that's missing is behavioral research. There's very little behavioral research in Pakistan. So again, we see, when I look at these papers, very little on that can be used. Yes, we lament climate change. Yes, we are very unhappy with climate change. Although, again, we contribute very little to climate change. And again, yes, what is climate change? Yeah, we're going to get floods. But we have got floods always. Our floods, I don't know whether the intensity has increased or not. Yeah, somebody should prove the point. And even if the intensity has improved, Do they cause harm because we do not manage them well or because nature intended it? I've done 4 or 5 podcasts with various experts, and they all say that the floods are not as bad as we think they are, but our management of them and our dealing with them is terrible. At the same time, yeah, of course, we'll have glacial melt, etc. Climate change is real, it's happening, but there's very little we can do about it. So there's no point in lamenting it. And if you tell me that we need more to deal with climate change, do we have the money to do that? And what do we need to do? Those things are missing. And there is this false promise that the world is going to bail us out because of climate change. Yeah, we've been bailed out for many things. And where have we got? So if the world bails us out for climate change, A, I'll be surprised. B, it's not going to do anything for us. Now, another area that people talk about a lot is Islamic economics. I wrote a number of papers in Islamic economics in my youth. But quite frankly, I'm not convinced that Islamic economics is a subject in itself. The only thing that I found of interest in Islamic economics, which I wrote about, is that if we take seriously the injunction that we have to have an interest-free economy, although we can discuss this, that should we have an interest-free economy or should we have a what they call a usury-free economy? Usury is an old a term which was used when the money lender had absolute control, a monopoly over people in a certain area, and he used to extract a huge rent from them. Although that myth also has been dealt with and challenged, but I won't go into that. But if we have an interest-free economy, yes, we can research that, talk about it. But then some people go into morality and so many other things. They try and build this huge preference function for Islam, which to my mind doesn't make sense, because we are no less altruistic or no more altruistic or no less selfish or no more selfish than others. We are the same as others. So for God's sakes, this it doesn't mean much to me. There is a lot of work that tries to talk about allocation of risk and making this market, that market, but very few people actually analyze the fact that Islamic banks have come into being and they are actually cheating. Well, I use a strong word, maybe that's wrong, but they're actually giving a much lower interest rate to depositors than conventional banks. And this should concern us. It's not something, it's not, I would withdraw the word cheating, but this should concern us. Why are they giving such a low interest rate compared to conventional banks? At the same time, they're charging more for lending rates. So is Islamic banking being used as a way to increase the spread of banks? That should be a very important subject, but nobody looks. Now I used AI to look at that again, and this is what AI says on method, insight, originality, and policy relevance. But what is missing in my mind, to my mind, and this is what I tried to do at PID when I was there, at the Planning Commission when I was there. What is missing, for example, is the land markets, and especially the public land monopoly, where the public sector takes control of city development. The bureaucrats take control of city development. They build their own housing colonies, and some housing colonies become central to the downtowns, and they don't allow them to move. They fix the zoning of the cities. They fix the floor area ratio so that you can't build above 2 stories. And then, of course, there's also another problem, the regulation, the sludge that we talked about, the NOCs, permits, inspections, rent seeking. These are very important. Then third, the bureaucratic. Bureaucrats maintain the sludge. Bureaucrats maintain the cities. They are monopolizing everything. We don't talk about that. And they do it because their incentives are not aligned with their work. Their incentives are to get postings, perks, promotions, transfers, and, plots. That is a distorted incentive. We know that from Stiglitz, Holmes, from many researchers, incentive contract researchers, that incentives have to be properly aligned. Here, the civil service investments are not properly aligned. Then protection is a very important subject. Then firm level productivity, misallocation, informality is very important. But this is something that we don't do. Now, here's another subject. I talked about it earlier too. Funding decides the research agenda. Donors avoid critical issues. They don't want to discuss the civil service. In fact, they're in bed with the civil service. We've talked about that often. Donors and civil service are they're really in bed with each other. There's no other way to say it, because the donors take them for scholarships. The donors give them projects. The donors get their loans funded by them. The donors take them on after their retirement. So You know, they really don't want to challenge the system. They want politically safe stuff. They don't want to challenge anything. They just want to lend money. That's all. And they want to lend money on their topics and the topics that interest Brussels or that interest Washington. So they want that. And they also want us to copy what they have made in the West. So, for example, the donors that I wrote about it gave us ombudsman. So we have more ombudsman than we need. The donors gave us regulators. We have more regulators than we need. But the donors didn't give us markets. The donors didn't tell us to decrease transactions costs. The donors didn't tell us that we should decrease regulation. This is our job. This is not the donors' job. But we don't do that. But then donors fund the research. So they fund the research. What they fund the research on land regulation. They don't do that. They don't focus on institutional honesty. They don't worry about that. What are the institutions? Even though Asimoglu and Moker, etc., all these guys who get the Nobel Prizes say, Paul Romer, Robert Lucas, that we should have institutions are what drives growth, not capital, not borrowing. They don't want to do that. They don't want us to uh, the research or the reform ideas. They don't want policy follow through. They only want to lend money. So there we are. The IMF and governance report also talks about elite capture, you know, corruption, macroeconomic costs of bad governance. Local research almost never does. I've talked about elite capture, 0.3% of Pakistani research, corruption, 2% of Pakistani research. Local research hardly evaluates donors, hardly tries to, because they can't. You can't challenge your own funder. I try and challenge the donors and they try and black me out. They try and cancel me. So you have to have incentives for local research. This is why I tried Rasta, but unfortunately failed. I admit it myself. The political economy of repeated IMF programs is never discussed. Well, as said, there's a huge career risk that people take if they challenge the donors. They won't get anywhere. They won't get into the donor organization. That's the be all and end all. I also use that to get into the donors. And yes, we have to have that. I wish the donors would recognize and actually allow some kind of debate between the Pakistani researchers and themselves and not try and act imperialistically. IMF can publish a 200-page report on Pakistan's governance, calling us corrupt and all kinds of things, but Pakistan cannot publish even a review of the IMF proposals. So we've had an explosive governance report from the IMF. We have 25 programs. I wonder why researchers don't react. Well, they don't want to take a career risk, right? Intellectually timidity, yeah, very intellectually timid research. There's no real challenge. There's no real desire to challenge any of the precepts of the donors and the powers that be. There's no desire to ask tough questions. There's no desire to do any clear analysis of why or where we are going wrong. So yes, intellectually timid research, very, and lots of papers, very little insight, very little insight. I sit down in a debate with researchers. I'm on lots of WhatsApp groups with them, and I try and debate with them. I cannot get a rise out of them on real issues. There's a huge productivity illusion. HEC has given us scopus and impact factor and citations. And people used to come to me all the time. I've got God knows, impact factor of 12 publication. I've got an impact factor of 10 publication. When I asked them, tell me the headline. They were, well, growth produces education. I said, how about vice versa? Yeah, it could happen. So, I mean, what have we learned? Nothing. I call them, okay, what do you learn? Well, dirty water causes dysentery. So what? But the survey says that. So I said, I've got a great regression. I said, but hell, I mean, my grandmother could told you. So I had this famous thing that I should tell you. I had the nanny test. The test is what my grandmother, who's not very well educated, knew should not constitute research. Research has to be something fresh. But unfortunately, we never get that. Typical output sort of mix that I said, research papers, small surveys, perception-based attitudes, Nothing really of interest. Some little bit of, thought piece, but really no studies. Now, let's look at how countries that developed used research. China, for example. I looked at some of the Chinese work and got, used my AI tools to look at Chinese work, and I find that China used land titling, land lease system, city finance. City is very important in China. Industrial upgrading, export product space, local government incentives. The local government is very important in China. Cadre evaluations, firm level productivity, misallocations. This is what China is studying. South Korea. South Korea, long-run export strategy, project product complexity, R&D technology diffusion, human capital, industrial policy, corporate governance, labor productivity, etc. Singapore, human housing market design, you know, congestion pricing, transport economics. I think we don't do any transport and congestion pricing. Congestion pricing is very important given the fact that we are sitting in cities that are hugely polluted, smog-based cities. And studies have shown that this smog is created by traffic. But we are spreading out cities, sprawl, but very little on congestion pricing, very little on housing market design, very little on transport economics. Public sector performance pay, we never do that. Integrity, never. Ports, logistics, and global connectivity, we never do those things. Those are important. Vietnam. Vietnam studied value chains, SECs, industrial parks, agricultural, manufacturing transition, integration to regional global value chains. Local incentive structures for officials. We never do that. So let's think reform. And five journals from each country, let's look at what we learn, right? This is what we did. Sorry, we did that. What I did was take five journals from each of these places and I compared them. This is what I found. Okay, now let's look at how the West used it. If you look at the West, all the way from the beginning, economics, institutions, and growth, this is the way they went. If you look at the AEA and other, earlier, as I said, go back all the way to Stigler, for example, he laid the basis for antitrust and competition policy. Innovation systems and growth. If you look at that, I mean, Nelson and so many people started looking at Richard Nelson and then down to, what is that guy's name in Carnegie? I've forgotten. And then Robert Lucas and, Paul Romer, etc. Productive cities, all the way from, Jesus, names I'm forgetting. But anyway, there's lots of studies on this thing. Urban zoning, probably Glazer is another person that comes to mind. You should probably get the Nobel Prize next time. There's so many others. Designing markets, for example, the energy, the telecom, the auctions, pricing. I mean, way back from the earliest days of energy pricing of when energy came out. I mean, electricity came out, telecom. All these studies were done by economists, and you can see journal after journal full of this stuff. And if you look at that, they also looked at research, policy, and state capability. Huge debate on tax systems in the West, as you know, Friedman and the other labor markets. Huge debate on labor markets. You can see Heckman and who else? There's another famous guy got the Nobel Prize for it. Civil service incentives, yeah. What is the famous book, Bureaucracy, and so many other people who've done this work on that. Central banking, yeah. Central banking is all developed by economic thinking in the West. Very important debates from all the way from, I've forgotten the name again, the famous English economist Bagehot to Keynes, down to Friedman, down to, Kuckerman, etc. Social services, yeah, all came out of economic research. Well, we avoid political economy, we avoid land, cities, contracts, we avoid regulation markets, we focus on small trivial regressions. Now, the other thing that I see is there's no dialectics in our, there's no debate, no schools of thought, no thesis, antithesis. Parallel, thousands of papers repeating the same thing. Harmless hypothesis, no engagement, no critique, no falsification. Nobody says, hey, so and so said this, and I've got this thing, a counter, or so and so. I'm challenging. I'm further investigating somebody's hypothesis, or I'm challenging that hypothesis. Oh, here, this hypothesis looks good. Or there's donor agenda. I'm challenging this, or maybe I'm examining it further, or maybe I'm deepening it. There's no dialectics, no debate in Pakistan's literature. Why? Because we're looking for citations. We're not looking for learning. We're not trying to learn. We are not doing what others say. We're not trying to shift a paradigm. In fact, I don't think we have a paradigm in the Pakistani economics. Why don't we? Um, Another thing, conferences. Yes, they put us in the mode of conferences, and donors have told us how to do a conference, and now we are doing it. Donors say to hold a conference, invite VIPs. So the VIPs must come, and we must greet them and take them in a cavalcade up on the stage, and they will basically deliver a speech and run away. And then the conference tamasha will begin. And then, of course, the conference will be dinner, lunch, and at a five-star hotel. It'll be dominated by chief guests, and then, of course, donors will come and present their work. Panels will be loaded by six, seven speakers who have 5 minutes each, and none of them have really studied the subject. None of them have really studied the subject. None of them really studied the subject. And we have development optics, very good development optics, but we really don't know um, the subject. So, yeah, that's very important. It's happened. Why do conferences fail? Because we have fear of. Uh, Hello, भाई क्या बात है? क्या बात है जी? कौन बोल रहा है? जी जाफरी साहब मुझे थोड़ी देर में कर. Uh, so why do conferences fail in Pakistan? Because we really have nothing to say. We have no debates. We have no ideas. We have no paradigm that we want to discuss. We have no policies we want to discuss. Donors come along and they've done something and they want to sell it for a loan. That's all we do. Academics are supposed to just come there and be like, what should I say? Be like performers. And as I said, six people to a panel who keep saying the same thing. No real questions, no really answers. So, yeah, the conferences become tamashas. And I know people hate my saying it, but it's true. When I go to a conference, I come back kind of sad. Um, so, we have to move on from performance to production, from photo ops to reform. We have to clear diagnosis of Pakistan's structural constraints, competing hypotheses and debates, actionable reform pathways, and real develop some white papers and steering committees and have some real theses and ideas. Have some Keynes versus Hayek debates. Have some Friedman versus Samuelson debates. That's what moves economics. So my paradigm shift, what I would like to see happen is Pakistan research culture must develop intellectual capacity. We have to study the colonial bureaucracy. We have to study the colonial system. We have to see where our laws need um, refreshing for a market economy. We have to contest donor dependency. Nobody's saying we should throw them out or whatever, but we should make them equal partners. They want to be development partners. They should be partners. Partners argue with each other. Partners develop trust with each other. Partners don't try and seek dominance one over the other. We should need to study our land markets. We need to study our cities. We need to study our systems, governance systems, our management systems, because we have no systems in this country. We need to study the regulatory overreach. We need to study the perks, plots, protocol culture that pervades the government, which is the basis of corruption. And this is where the IMF is at fault. They never looked at that culture. They just looked at corruption without looking at, hey, what's underpinning the culture? Why do we have Plotistan? Why do we have a perks culture? Why do we have protocol culture? IMF, there's no protocol. I've been there for 30 years. There's no protocol. There's no plot culture. Nobody gives them an official house. We also need to worry about decentralizing, professionalizing, and autonomizing. There's no autonomous agencies in Pakistan. Everything's run by the secretary. There's no professional agency in the government because everything is run by the DMG. There's no decentralization anywhere because the secretary wants to centralize everything. The minister wants to centralize everything. We need to develop a paradigm shifting debate. We need to develop paradigms and debate them. And we need to confront each other with good hypothesis and argumentation, not just fighting and not just trying to pull each other down. The typical debate in Pakistan is an ad hominem, trying to tell you, hey, you know, you were in the government, or you are too old, or you are this, but it's all personal focus, not on ideas. And this is the problem that we have to develop an intellectual culture. HEC failed. HEC gave us this stupid Taylorist philosophy where they were measuring outputs, not measuring ideas. We need to get to measuring ideas. I hope this helps. I'm ready to debate. I'm going to talk more on this. I'm ready to debate. I keep telling every one of these academics, let's come and debate this. I hope this video helps develop a debate. Let's talk about academia in Pakistan. Otherwise, quite frankly, I don't know what good economics is. And I've got to the stage now where I tell young people don't study economics. Even the government doesn't want to talk to economists. If you look at the last so many years, the government has not appointed a single economist to any position. The government has not even rewarded a single economist. The only economist the government gave a medal to is for favoritism, not for work. And nobody in Pakistan, nobody wants honors economists. In fact, they think bankers are better managers of the economy, bankers are better managers of regulatory agencies, bankers are better managers of banks than economists. If economists want to make themselves relevant, they should listen to this and they should try and develop an agenda of research, of debate, of ideas. All the best, folks. Thank you very much. Do subscribe to SIA. Do comment. Do share. Do do discuss things. Make economics live for you. After all, this country is for you, and economics will make your life better. Otherwise, my take is you guys don't want to develop. You want to watch the political narrative. Well, that watching the political narrative is very costly. If you participate in this and make a narrative, they may listen to you. So watch SIA, subscribe to SIA, and listen to what we are saying. All the best. Thank you. Bye bye.